Our first speaker this morning is April Luke. April is from the US EPA. She serves as a scientific technical advisor in the areas of toxicology and risk assessment in support of the office missions to provide policy, guidance, and direction for the agency's emergency response program. April has a BS in microbiology and chemistry and an MS in chemistry from Northern Arizona University and an MS in toxicology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Go Heels. And now April's going to talk this morning about risk-based values for evaluating surface exposure to chemical warfare agents. April?
All right, good morning, and thank you for coming to my talk. When I've been asked to do presentations in the past, especially when we've done trainings, I've often used Britney Spears' Toxic to get everyone's attention. I thought about doing that here, but maybe not the right situation, but I'll spare you that ear worm, or maybe not, maybe just the mere fact that I mentioned it will now be in your head. So if you like the song and it pops in your head later, you're welcome. If you don't, and you despise the song, I'm sorry. All right, so enough silliness. Going to be talking today about risk-based values to evaluate surface exposures to chemical warfare agents. So EPA's cleanup role. Under the National Response Plan, our traditional role, the role we've been doing since 1970, in fact, December 2nd, 1970, when EPA was established, is to address remediation of oil and hazardous substances. So designated hazardous substances that go through regulation, pollutants are contaminants. This also can include chemical, biological, and radiological materials, and that's apparent as EPA has participated in the demilitarization cleanup sites for a good 20 so years. That's our traditional role. After 9/11, our role expanded as the Homeland Security Program was begun. We then went from looking at remediation of environmental media, soil, air, water, to now having to address things like building surfaces and building interiors. And with this expanded role, we're looking at also large area decontamination of things like large metropolitan areas and transportation hubs like airports. But whether we are looking to address environmental contaminants in soil, air, water, or we're starting to look at decontaminating surfaces on buildings or inside buildings, we have overarching goals in common. EPA has the goal of wanting to protect human health and the environment, or as Maureen Gwynn had put it, one health, one environment. And we want, to the extent feasible, to return the site, the land, the water to a normal, right? And the desired endpoint is that any contaminated area is decontaminated or remediated to an acceptable level for reuse, that any items that are produced in that cleanup process are disposed of appropriately, remediation efforts are done in a cost and timely efficient manner, and of course that the outcome of remediation is acceptable to the local public and to the local governments. And at EPA, those cleanup decisions are risk-based. So what do I mean when I say risk? I like to define for my audience what I mean, just to make sure we're on the same page. When I'm talking about risk today, I'm focusing on human health. And so it's looking at the chance of harm to human health from a given exposure to a substance. And many of you have probably seen this simplistic equation where you get risk when you have a substance that can produce an adverse health effect and exposure to that. You need both. And when I talk about risk-based decisions, I'm talking about those decisions that inform actions that center that human health protection. So how do we go about looking at risk-based decisions and a response? If we take a CWA event and we look from from the incident happening, moving through crisis management to consequence management, there are certain questions that need to be answered to make informed decisions, such as what is the toxicant? What is the substance there? Where is it? And is it at a level of concern for human health? Can we address it? And when will it be okay? When can people return to the space safely? And throughout that whole process, what can we say about it? What is the risk communication that is important to convey to the decision makers and to the public? And for EPA, as we are looking to remediate for long-term health protection and for the use to come back and reuse the space, we want to ask, how clean is clean? This is quippy. I'm going to add a little caveat that when you think of this, how clean is clean, you also want to think about for what activity. If you were to ask somebody in the military, they would say, how clean is clean so that the operation can continue and the mission be completed. For EPA and what I'm talking about today, how clean is so that little Susie and her dog Spot can return home and live in that space without adverse health effects from long-term exposure. So how do we start to answer these questions? We do a risk assessment. We use that to estimate the human health effects associated with exposure to the chemicals that have been released. We combined the toxicity estimate that estimates how much adverse potential health effects can be had. And we also look at exposure estimates, that being the concentration in the environment, as well as how much is actually getting inside the person. So if we take that basic equation, we can make it also be that risk equals toxicity times concentration and intake. So we need to answer these questions through risk assessment. How do we do that? We use a tool, a risk-based value. This is a quantitative tool that is used to understand and characterize health hazards posed by exposure at that site. So how do we determine these? How do we calculate them? What we can do is we can establish an acceptable risk and then mathematically solve for the concentration that equates to that risk. And that becomes our risk-based cleanup value. So when we set the target risk to something like no adverse health effects, then that risk-based cleanup value, if we can clean to that level or lower, any human in that space should not develop or has less likelihood of developing adverse health effects from the exposure to that chemical. So why do we care about these for a chemical warfare agent cleanup? First of all, EPA, we have many decades of experience in doing this kind of cleanup for land or soil, air, water. When our mission expanded to building surfaces and interiors, there were some different challenges that come about. This includes that there are less guidance for us on how to do these kind of cleanups. We have to be concerned more with the direct contact with surfaces and indirect contact from touching a surface and hand-to-mouth activity. If we're looking at chemical warfare agents, we're looking at a substance that's highly toxic and probably has, or definitely has, a steeper dose response curve. So the difference between the concentration that causes an acute effect and that might cause death or long-term health effects is much shorter. And we also have to consider specific properties. Chemical properties. Is it a substance that will remain persistent in the environment? Does it create sinks in certain materials and that will leach out? I believe Lucas has research on some of that. We want to look at different kind of exposures. When you're inside, you might not be getting some of the dissipation that would happen outside. You have to think about how HVAC systems may affect it. And all of this creates a challenge because we have guidance for what to do in the environment. How do we learn and do inside an indoor space? So that I identified a gap for us. We need surface exposure cleanup values. This is when we turn to look at what was done for the World Trade Center. What they did in the World Trade Center, they had many surfaces that needed to be cleaned indoor, lots of dust, contaminated level dust. and they needed to be able to decontaminate, clean it, and then be able to do confirmatory sampling that the space was safe. So they looked to sample methodologies for determining health hazards if you touch a surface and either direct contact or hand-to-mouth activity. And they went to the Office of Pesticides. They liked this methodology, but they adjusted it, and they adjusted it so that the exposure factors that went into this calculation reflected more of an application of looking at cleanup in spaces related to the World Trade Center versus pesticides. And from that, they drew from the risk assessment guidelines for Superfund, or RAGs. This is an established set of guidance for the Superfund program in EPA. And they also looked to the scientific literature for different inputs for the exposure parameters. So basically, they set an acceptable level, found chemical-specific toxicity values, and then adjusted those exposure parameters to come up with their health protective cleanup values. The reason we were drawn to using this in our preparedness work is the fact that this approach is rather simple. There are other surface exposure calculations. Cal EPA has one, the Office of Pesticides, the Army, and they all have their pluses and minuses. But the beauty of using this one is it's fairly simple, and you can draw upon available oral reference doses. And it's very good for using when you don't know the extent of contamination or the rate of dissipation from different surfaces. This still gives you an ability to calculate a health protective value. Also, it's flexible. So as I said, you can look at the exposure parameters and adjust them to better suit whatever situation you're looking at. Are you looking at a workspace and you need to consider workers? Are you looking at homes and you need to consider children? That can all be adjusted. Additionally, the level of target risk you use to calculate that level is adjustable depending on the risk management needs. For example, EPA has an acceptable risk range for cancer of 10 to the 4 to 10 to the minus 6. We may begin by calculating a health protective value at 10 to the minus 6, but looking at the risk management needs, realize it will take 10 years and $100 million to accomplish. Could we go to 10 to the minus 5? Still health protective, but perhaps half the cost and takes half the time. So that's nice with this. It gives us flexibility. And what we did is we calculated default values that could be used in our exercises and start as a ground for us to begin to work. But we can make these numbers site specific if in a real response. But we often start in a very conservative stance. And the thing I like to drive home is these values, we get a lot of like, give me a number. And they like to, there's this attitude that one value is the value for everything, kind of like one ring to rule them all. It's not true. Really, the values will change depending on the question you are asking, but they need to be based in defensible science and sound judgment. So if you're ever interacting with your toxicologist or a risk assessor, it's best to go to them with a question. What question you're trying to answer, and then they can adjust the numbers to what you are trying to achieve. So in our calculations, we use these target risks and exposure parameters, either for an occupational adult or for a residential adult or child. This means that we looked at durations that were typical of a workspace or home, and then intake values that represented an adult or a child. And then we combine them with the oral toxicity values, the RFDs, or the cancer slope factor. And this is key because we don't have dermal reference doses, and we are able to use the oral reference dose to calculate a dermal reference dose to use in this calculation. We took this calculation, or we took that information, put it into this calculation. Just a quick overview, the RFD represents the toxicity input. This first part here is the component for the incidental hand-to-mouth activity. And so you can see that it includes things such as mouthing surface, mouthing frequency. This part here is the component that looks at the direct dermal contact and includes things like contact rate and dermal absorption. And these are the values, the default values we've calculated for our exercises. Again, I'm going to stress that these can be made site specific or even exercise specific. But what you can see is that the child is a lot more conservative or lower than the adults. This is understandable. Children have a higher rate of intake. And of course, as you would expect, the occupational adult is higher, but that's because they're shorter durations. You're looking at a work time, not a living space. Having these, and I'll point out that this is also, I calculated for non-cancer on non-porous surfaces. There is a similar equation for cancer, and there's also a factor you can put in there for porous surfaces. The reason we went with non-porous is if we're dealing with a chemical warfare agent, we're probably not going to try to remediate something like carpet. We're going to likely rip it out and not spend our time and money on that. That's why we focused on non-porous surfaces. So it's great we have these numbers. The numbers are great, but we need to step back, zoom out, and think about them in the application of the entire response. So these values established can be used to look at site characterization data to establish where the contamination is and is it at a level of concern. And the next kind of level question then we need to ask is, can we actually see that with our laboratory capabilities? And also those wipe samples, how representative are they of the actual contamination at the site? If we look at our Decon methodology in context of these values, are we going to be able to decon to that level of health protection? It's great if we can remove a certain amount of the chemical through decon, but if it doesn't quite reach that level where we can say, if you're in this space, you will likely not have a health effect, is it good enough? When we start to go towards clearance, we want to use these values to not only consider what might be achieved through our technical capabilities and our decon, but we want to think about what are the lines of evidence? What can we show with our post-decon and sampling data that the space is clean, and what other data do we need to convince people? And do we identify any uncertainties in doing this process? And finally, when we get to what can we say about it, will we be able to combine these lines of evidence and this understanding of uncertainties to convince ourselves, decision makers, and the public that it's safe to return? So just for a quick nod to doing that kind of reality check, and I'm glad Larry's here. He can check me on my Phyllis numbers. I took the child's number and adjusted it for a 10 by 10 wipe sampling space, and then compared it against our Phyllis detection limits. And we can see, luckily, we're able to detect to the level of those cleanup values. This is great news, because if we can't, there's a discussion about how to address that uncertainty. Because if you have a non-detect that you're not confident is an actual non-detect, that is something we need to address. So as we look at those questions, those deeper questions of, we know what we want to reach for clean, can we do it with our capability in our labs? Can we do it with our technologies? What are the uncertainties? We are starting to move from the risk assessment, what is the hazard, to the risk management. What can we do about it? And this is where we're starting to look at our remediation options and using this context of the cleanup value, the surface cleanup value, and understanding those uncertainties and asking, what can we do? What are we going to do? And the aim of this is to balance our desire to clean up to as low as we possibly can with the challenge of doing it in a certain cost, a certain time, with the capabilities, technical capabilities we have, while still focusing on protecting human health. So as we move through our response, what do we want? We want to be confident. We want to be confident that we know where the contamination is at a level of concern. And we want to be confident that when we decon, that space has really been cleaned. And what do we need? We need to understand wherever these uncertainties lie. Can we actually detect that limit? Can we sample and trust those samples? When we do post-decon sampling, do we trust that when it says it's non-detect, it's actually non-detect? And these tools, these surface exposure cleanup values, are the tool for doing that. So again, zooming out, thank you. If we look at our preparedness activities and response in a risk analysis paradigm, we use research to inform our risk assessment that informs our risk management. And then these also feed back the needs for risk assessment and research. If we take our values, these cleanup values, and think about them in this larger picture, we see that they provide us a means for understanding what health protection is and our abilities to achieve it. That when we look at any differences between our capabilities in cleaning it and remediating it, we understand the uncertainties, which allows us to then think about the best ways to address those uncertainties. And then this understanding of our capabilities and our uncertainties can feed into identifying future research gaps, which all of you, a number of you, work on. So as you can see, these values are a very useful tool. I like to think they're not the only tool, but they're a very important one, kind of like a ruler, measure twice, cut once. And with that, I ask if there's any questions.
Anybody have any questions?
April, this was the technique we used to come up with the surface cleanup levels for the ESS pursuit in 2010. Is that the same value? Okay. All right.
Yeah. I meant to mention that not only did we pull because this was used in World Trade Center very effectively, EPA has been using it for various exercises like OTECRA, and we have also employed it in an actual response where it was a sulfur muster. Yeah, it got pulled up onto a clam and broke open. This methodology was used to create the clearance values for when all the cleanup was done and we were convincing the public health that it was safe for these fishermen to go back onto their ship.
April, Lucas Audians, EPA. Question for you. In the presentation that I gave actually on Tuesday morning, I also mentioned that there were actually two calculated numbers for calculate for the OTECRA exercise based on the hazard quotient. Can you elaborate a little bit on, because I did not see it in the presentation itself, what the function of that was?
So a hazard quotient of 1 or a hazard index of 1, it considers that RFD, that is the value that level or below should not, if you're exposed to that, should not give you adverse health effects. So when you use 1, you're saying the environmental contamination and that value is like a ratio of 1 to 1. So that is like health protection. By dropping it to a 0.1, which we do in the Superfund program when we're looking at multiple contaminants, you're building in a layer of additional protection. And so it's like dividing that 1 by 10. And if you can reach it, that would be really great, but you're still health protective at that one.
Are we good?
All right, thank you.